Hi teachers, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Jessica Tobin from Elementary Nest, and we are back this week with some new teaching content. This week, we are going to be talking about the Ask and Answer Questions Standards. That is your building block standard. That is where everything begins. So the Ask and Answer Standard is both reading literature and reading informational. So I'm going to bounce back and forth between the two domains. Keep in mind they will be two completely separate units when you're teaching them, but I will kind of bounce back and forth throughout this video to talk about processes and best practices for teaching that standard. So in this video, we're going to talk about how to deconstruct your ask and answer standard, and I will give you a little freebie with an already deconstructed Common Core standard. We are also going to go over ways that you can scaffold this unit to make it into smaller chunks for the students to understand. And then we're going to talk about some fun practice activities and some suggestions such as mentor text and anchor charts. So let's dive right in. So we're going to start with where to begin first, and that's going to be during your planning process, which, first things first, you have two jobs. Your first job is to fully understand that standard, which deconstructing is typically the way that you can do that. I do have deconstructed standards for the Ask and Answer standard for K through 4, both informational and literature. That is a freebie. I'll put the link on the screen now, but it's also in the description below. If you are interested in downloading that, it will go right to your email inbox. You also will want to check out your vertical alignment. That's going to be checking the grade up and the grade below you. So if you are a second grade teacher, you want to check out what they're expected to do in third grade. If you're a second grade teacher, you want to see what they're coming to you with from first grade. I know that third grade or the shift between third and fourth grade is where it kind of goes from simply asking and answer questions from the text into inferring and gathering those observations and those inferences. So you definitely want to check that vertical alignment to help you understand where your students should be and where you're going to want them to go. That's going to really help you with your grade level's mastery. Also, before you begin your lesson, go ahead and stock up on all of the mentor text and read alouds and even the picture books that your students are going to use throughout your unit. These are going to be high interest books that really portray the standard. So you want to pick books that you are going to be able to really pick out questions that the students can discuss. So something with, a very clear plot, something with very clear images and illustrations. When you pick out which books you want to teach for your unit, I would go ahead and mark them up. If you don't want to mark on, obviously you don't want to highlight, but put Post-it notes in there, maybe put a little highlighter strip in there that's removable and safe. What I think would be fantastic, and I know it will take a little time, but what I think would be fantastic would be going ahead and putting Post-it notes on each of the pages of possible questions that you can ask as you're reading that text aloud. Also, on the inside of the book, like right on the inner cover, you can have some questions that you might want to ask before you're reading. And then at the end, on the back side, you can put Post-it notes that you can ask after they read. So you do want to have those opportunities to ask and answer questions before, during, and after. So go ahead and get those books that you want. I do have a blog post that outlines high interest mentor text and read alouds for the Ask and Answer standard. So if you're interested in checking out which books I suggest, the link is in the description. So last week we talked all about scaffolding your writing lessons, and we're also going to carry that over and talk about it this week. So we are going to talk about scaffolding this standard and then scaffolding your lessons within the standard. So scaffolding is just basically taking apart your unit or your standard to make it more manageable and understandable for the students. So in that process, you're going to take your standard and you're going to break it down into mini lessons within your big unit. So you're going to maybe have, and you're going to use your deconstructed standard to really help you with that. So you're going to look at those power verbs that you pulled out. You're going to look at your what students can do and what you want students to know, and you're going to use that to scaffold. So instead of just teaching the students how to ask and answer questions, blanket activities, what you can do is break it into answering questions activities, asking questions activities, answering questions before a read aloud, answering questions after a read aloud, asking questions during a read aloud. So there's lots of pieces that you can really break the standard down and make it more understandable and more easily achieved for your students. Every good unit is also going to have very strong anchor charts. So your anchor charts are something that you're going to be able to refer back to throughout your unit. One thing I would suggest is having a teaching anchor chart as well as having an interactive anchor chart. So the teaching anchor chart is going to be kind of your introduction to the standard. You're teaching the students the big overarching themes of the standard, what they're expected to learn, the 5 W's. And then your interactive chart is going to be, you've taught them the standard, now they're going to get their hands on it, they're going to practice it. A couple fun introductory interactive anchor chart ideas would be, splitting your chart up into questions versus statements and having the students get a Post-it note and putting one example of a question and one example of a statement. That's going to be, first and second K1, 2 grades. And then they're going to get a little bit more difficult. So maybe for each read aloud, and this would be an anchor chart that I would suggest laminating so that you can reuse it for many read alouds. But having an anchor chart that's divided into beginning, during, and after, and maybe having the students ask themselves a question before the read aloud and putting it on a Post-it note. And then having the students ask a question during the read aloud and put it on a Post-it. And then, of course, having them ask a question, answer. Ask a question after the read aloud. And then they can go back in after you're done with the read aloud. And as the teacher, you can just pull a couple of their examples or all of them and turn it into an activity where they asked all these questions and now you're going to try to answer it using that text. Another part of scaffolding lessons is to really bring in that prior knowledge and that familiar information that they already have stored in their brain. So I did discuss this in the anchor chart part about, questions versus statements. But when you're in your earlier grades, like if you're K1 and 2, it is very important, to start super basic and teach them statements versus questions. And then you can bump it up a level and you can teach them strong questions versus so you can do thick and thin, strong and easy, you can do easy peasy. Or those thick questions that you're asking, that's going to be, why did the third little pig make that decision? Based off of a thin question, what color were the bricks? So teaching those students that yes, these are ways to ask questions and even answer questions in a text, but these are ways to ask and answer, strong questions. Now, I will suggest as you're scaffolding and breaking apart this unit, I would suggest teaching the answering part first because that's going to be much easier to teach your students than the asking. Asking just requires a lot more inferencing and brain power for the students. So if you're wanting to start your unit easier and then progressively get harder, I would suggest starting, just answering questions, reading aloud, answering what happened, reading aloud, asking why they think something happened, or how they might feel. And then they can get into asking before, during, after, asking questions to learn more. And then asking questions also is going to be very important with nonfiction as well. After you have introduced your standard and you have taught the skills itself and you've given the students those building blocks into learning about it, then you can start your practice. That practice is going to be something you want to do every day. Your students need to have texts in their hands every day, either with a read aloud or a picture book or a passage or some sort of like task card, short blurb activity. You want those students to have that opportunity every single day to ask questions, answer questions, mark up the text, and really dive into this skill. I also was saying at the beginning of this unit that you should teach the ask and answer fiction and ask and answer nonfiction question or standards separately. So I would suggest having 2 separate units, and they don't even have to be back to back. You can teach your ask and answer standard for fiction in August and September. Most teachers start this as their building block standard, and then teaching a couple other familiar fiction units like story elements and retelling, those things that are a little bit easier for the students to understand, and then diving into your nonfiction. I will say, even if you don't do the fiction, nonfiction, ask and answer back to back, I would suggest certainly starting with your ask and answer at the beginning of the year for fiction, and then whichever nonfiction standard you begin with, that always be your ask and answer. It's going to be your building block, it's your bread and butter. You're going to revisit that and get mastery for that throughout the year because it just naturally happens in almost every single standard you're going to teach. And also, you will scaffold your lessons for the nonfiction the same way that you scaffolded your lessons for the fiction. So you're going to start with the difference between statements and questions in the nonfiction sense. You're going to also start with asking questions about the nonfiction text before, during, and after, and giving the students those opportunities to go back in the text and find their answers. For both RL and RI units, you're going to really try to focus on text evidence after the students get familiar and comfortable with asking and answering questions. So what I mean by text evidence is, finding any way for them to go back to the text and find their answers. You can have them underline, if it's a passage, you can have them underline, highlight, color code. If it's within a picture book, you might want to say, like, write the page number that you found this answer. Some teachers have them write the exact sentence depending on their grade level. But you always want to focus on that text evidence. During assessment, it is important that you are assessing the students on both the skill itself and the understanding of the skill. So you are wanting them to, or you're going to want to assess them on their ability to, yes, ask and answer questions on their nonfiction and fiction units, but you also want them to understand their expectations. So ask them on their assessment what a question is. Ask them what a statement is. Ask them to give an example of a strong question. Ask them to give an example of a thin question and the difference between the two. So that's a really good way to really assess if they've fully understood that standard within their unit. They can perform the standard and they can understand what's expected of them as well. So one way you can do this is through graphic organizers that don't have anything to do with a particular text. They can just practice a skill of, sorting weak questions versus strong questions or thick and thin. They can create a database of questions to ask, during a nonfiction text or a fiction text. Another way is your quick checks. A quick check, these are examples that I've created. Quick checks you can scaffold and kind of increase the intensity each day. So day one, you might ask a couple of questions about the standard itself. And if you are teaching the students their I can statements, or if you're introducing an anchor chart, you're getting that opportunity to teach the standard itself without simply reading the standard to them. So, day 1, you're asking them about the standard itself. Day 2, you're pulling back a little bit and you're saying, how did you apply this standard? And then day 3, you kind of get into ways that they can practice that skill without reading a text. And then once they get familiar with asking or answering questions about the standard itself, then like day 4, day 5, day 6, on those quick checks, they can read a text and practice answering questions about the text. Now, when you get to your final assessment, which is going to be, the end day of this unit, you want to make sure that you are assessing the students on the actual standard and not their reading skill. Because yes, it's important for you to test them on their reading comprehension throughout the year, and you want to ensure that students can take a test and answer it. But in these standards-based units, you really want to make sure that you are assessing them on the actual standard. So I would suggest for K1 and 2 maybe to read them those questions so that you are able to get a full view of their knowledge of the skill itself, instead of, if they're struggling readers, they can't prove that they know the standard. So I would suggest maybe reading them the questions and having them answer so that they can prove they know the standard. They're just working on the comprehension levels on their own time. So that covers all of the ways that you can scaffold and teach the ask and answer standards for both fiction and nonfiction. I do have grades K through 3 that cover this particular skill, and I will put links down below in the description if you're interested in buying any of the ready-made lesson plans. They come with lesson plans, graphic organizers, passages that have Lexile ranges or Lexile levels on them that I had professionally Lexiled. They have task cards and interactive notebook pieces, and then a final assessment piece. I have both fiction and nonfiction that I will put in the description below. Keep in mind the kindergarten unit looks a little different. Kindergarten does not have Lexile levels simply because they're not really expected to read those on their own. It's more of an instructional passage that the teacher is going to use with the students, but they're still expected to learn and demonstrate understanding of the standard. If you have any questions at all about this, please email me at elementarinest@gmail.com or leave a comment below and I will do my best to respond right away. Next week, we will be back with more teaching tips. Make sure to like and subscribe to this so that you can always get your brand new video in your feed. And I will talk to you guys next week. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bye.